General Franz Holder stood perfectly still in the conference room at the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. It was the 23rd of July 1942, and the chief of the German General Staff had just witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Adolf Hitler had torn up the carefully prepared operational plans for Case Blue, Germany's summer offensive in the Soviet Union, and replaced them with his own contradictory directives that violated every principle of military strategy Holder had learned in 4 decades of service. But it wasn't the strategic insanity that froze Halder in place. It was the look in Hitler's eyes as he screamed at his generals, spittle flying from his mouth, face purple with rage. The Führer's hands trembled violently. His left leg shook uncontrollably. His pupils were dilated, possibly from the methamphetamine injections his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, administered daily. Hitler was ranting about Jewish conspiracies, about generals who lacked willpower, about destiny and providence. This wasn't anger. This wasn't even fanaticism. This was madness, clinical and undeniable. Holder had spent 2 years making excuses for Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior, attributing it to stress or unconventional genius. But standing in that room on July 23rd, 1942, watching Hitler literally foam at the mouth while ordering the Wehrmacht to simultaneously attack in 2 opposite directions with insufficient forces for either objective, Holder finally accepted what he had been denying. Germany was being led by a lunatic. The realization didn't come suddenly to most German generals. It accumulated through incidents, orders, and decisions that individually seemed merely eccentric, but collectively revealed a mind detached from reality. The process of recognition varied among the Wehrmacht's leadership, but certain moments stood out as inflection points when denial became impossible for Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. The moment came on December 18th, 1941, outside Moscow. German armies had advanced to within sight of the Kremlin before Soviet counterattacks and brutal winter weather forced them backward. Von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, requested permission to conduct tactical withdrawals to defensible positions, shortening his overstretched lines and preserving his exhausted troops. Hitler's response arrived by teleprinter. There will be no retreat. Troops will hold their positions regardless of enemy breakthrough on their flanks or rear. Commanders who order withdrawal without my permission will be court-martialed and shot. Von Bock read the order 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. This wasn't military strategy. This was suicide dressed up as determination. German units with Soviet forces already behind them were forbidden to retreat. Troops without winter equipment, ammunition, or food were ordered to hold positions in -4 0-degree temperatures. The order guaranteed the destruction of entire divisions. Von Bock immediately protested, explaining in carefully worded military language that the order would result in catastrophic casualties without achieving any strategic objective. Hitler's response was to relieve von Bock of command. The field marshal was replaced by officers who would implement the insane orders without question. But Hitler's no-retreat order, though militarily irrational, wasn't clinically insane. It reflected fanaticism and ideological rigidity, not detachment from reality. The truly revealing moment for von Bock came during his final meeting with Hitler before being dismissed. The Führer spent 30 minutes explaining that Soviet resistance would collapse because Slavic peoples were racially inferior and genetically incapable of sustained military effort. When von Bock mentioned that Soviet forces had just recaptured Kalinan and Tula, inflicting 50,000 German casualties in the process, Hitler waved this away as temporary setbacks caused by disloyal generals. That was when von Bock understood Hitler wasn't ignoring reality to maintain morale or project confidence. He genuinely believed his own racial ideology overrode observable facts. When reality contradicted Nazi theory, Hitler dismissed reality. That wasn't strategic deception or propaganda. That was insanity. General Heinz Guderian, perhaps the Wehrmacht's most brilliant panzer commander, had his revelation on March 21st, 1943. Guderian had been recalled from disgrace to serve as Inspector General of Armoured Troops after Hitler's previous purge of competent commanders. His task was to rebuild the panzer forces devastated at Stalingrad and in North Africa. Guderian prepared comprehensive reports on German tank production losses and requirements. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. Germany was producing approximately 600 tanks monthly. The Wehrmacht was losing approximately 800 tanks monthly on the Eastern Front alone, not counting losses in North Africa, Italy, and to Allied bombing. Simple arithmetic proved that Germany's armoured forces were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Guderian presented these figures to Hitler on March 21st, arguing that Germany needed to adopt a defensive strategy until production could catch up with losses. The panzer forces required time to rebuild, retrain, and re-equip. Launching major offensives with inadequate forces would simply accelerate the rate of tank losses. Hitler listened to Guderian's presentation, studied the charts and graphs, and then calmly explained that the statistics were wrong. German production would increase dramatically because of willpower and National Socialist determination. Tank losses would decrease because German soldiers were racially superior. The Soviet Union would collapse within months because Bullicheism was inherently weak. Guderian stared at Hitler in disbelief. These weren't opinions or hopes. Hitler was stating them as facts despite all evidence to the contrary. When Guderian pointed out that German tank production had been declining for 6 months, not increasing, Hitler accused him of defeatism and threatened to have him arrested. That was Guderian's moment of clarity. Hitler wasn't just strategically incompetent. He was genuinely delusional, constructing an alternative reality where Nazi ideology determined outcomes rather than industrial capacity, logistics, and military force ratios. Guderian realized he was serving a madman who would lead Germany to total destruction, while insisting until the end that victory was inevitable. Field Marshal Ger von Rundstedt's moment came earlier than most during the planning for Operation Barbarossa in early 1941. Rundstedt commanded Army Group South for the invasion of the Soviet Union. During a planning conference, he asked Hitler what Germany would do if the Soviet Union didn't collapse after the initial border battles. Hitler looked at Rundstedt as if the question made no sense. The Soviet Union will collapse? Hitler stated with absolute certainty. We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Rundstedt pressed the point. What if the door didn't collapse? What if Soviet forces retreated into the vast interior? What if the war continued into winter? Hitler became agitated, insisting that such scenarios were impossible. The Wehrmacht would destroy the Red Army in 6 to 8 weeks. Moscow would fall. Stalin would be overthrown or flee. The war would end before winter. When Rundstedt mentioned that Napoleon had similar assumptions before invading Russia in 1812, Hitler exploded. He screamed that Rundstedt was a defaist, that the comparison to Napoleon was treasonous, that German racial superiority guaranteed victory. The tirade lasted 15 minutes and included threats to relieve Rundstedt of command before the invasion even began. General Friedrich Pace had his revelation later than most. Trapped in Stalingrad in January 1943, Paulus was an obedient officer who followed orders without question. Even when encircled, even when his army was starving and freezing, he maintained faith that Hitler's promises of relief would materialize. The moment came on January 24th, 1943, when Paulus received notification that Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal. The promotion came with a clear message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than capitulate, taking the entire Sixth Army to death with him. Paulus sat in his frozen basement headquarters, reading the promotion order while listening to his soldiers dying of starvation outside. Hitler's message was transparent. The Führer cared more about preserving the symbolic myth that German field marshals never surrender than about the lives of 91,000 German soldiers. Rather than authorize a breakout when it was possible or permit surrender when continued resistance was pointless, Hitler demanded theatrical suicide. That was when Paulus understood Hitler wasn't making difficult military decisions based on strategic calculations. He was sacrificing an entire army for symbolic purposes, living in a fantasy world where gestures and mythology mattered more than soldiers' lives. Paulus surrendered anyway, refusing to participate in Hitler's death cult. The decision haunted him for the rest of his life, but he recognized that obeying an insane order would have been worse. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's moment of recognition came gradually through 1943 and early 1944. Rommel had been one of Hitler's favourites, the celebrated desert fox whose victories in North Africa had made him a propaganda icon. But Rommel was a practical soldier who understood logistics, supply lines, and realistic assessments of enemy capabilities. After the defeat in North Africa, Rommel was assigned to inspect coastal defences in France in preparation for the anticipated Allied invasion. He submitted detailed reports explaining that Germany lacked the resources to defend the entire coastline, that Allied air superiority would make it impossible to move reserves effectively, and that the only hope was to defeat the invasion on the beaches in the first 48 hours. Hitler rejected every recommendation. The Führer insisted that German forces would easily repel any invasion attempt, that Allied soldiers were weak and cowardly, that secret wonder weapons would ensure German victory. When Rommel provided intelligence assessments showing Allied invasion preparations involved millions of troops and thousands of ships, Hitler dismissed them as Allied disinformation. Rommel's final realization came during a meeting in March 1944. He had just returned from inspecting the Atlantic Wall and understood that Allied invasion was imminent. He tried to explain to Hitler that Germany needed to seek a political settlement with the Western Allies, concentrating German forces against the Soviet Union as the greater existential threat. Hitler's response was to launch into a 2-hour monologue about destiny, providence, and miracle weapons that would turn the war around. The Führer described imaginary jets, rockets, and advanced U-boat that existed only as prototypes or hadn't been built at all. He insisted that Germany would soon be producing these weapons in vast quantities, that they would destroy Allied bombing fleets and sink invasion armadas. Ramos sat listening to fantasies presented as operational plans. He realized Hitler had completely detached from reality, inhabiting a delusional world where wish fulfillment replaced military analysis. The field marshal left that meeting knowing Germany was doomed and that its leader was clinically insane. The most chilling moment of recognition came for those generals close enough to observe Hitler's physical and mental deterioration. Colonel Klaus von Stahlenberg, who would later attempt to assassinate Hitler, had regular access to Führer conferences in 1943 and 1944. He watched Hitler's health collapse in real time. The tremors worsened monthly. Hitler's left hand shook so badly he had to hold it with his right hand to stop the movement. His left leg dragged when he walked. His face had developed a greyish pallor. He was hunched over, aged far beyond his 54 years. Most disturbingly, his eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, occasionally rolling back in his head during conferences. Dr. Morel was injecting Hitler with a cocktail of medications that included methamphetamine, oxycodone, testosterone, and numerous vitamins and supplements. The daily injections kept Hitler functioning, but at the cost of his mental stability. Stauffenberg watched the Führer's mood swing wildly during a single conference, from euphoric confidence to paranoid rage to depressive fatigue. But it was Hitler's disconnect from basic facts that most alarmed Stauffenberg. In July 1944, just before Stauffenberg's assassination attempt, Hitler explained his plan to defeat the coming Allied invasion of France. The plan involved divisions that no longer existed, panzer reserves that had been destroyed months earlier, and air support from a Luftwaffe that had ceased to function as an effective combat force. When staff officers gently mentioned that some of the units Hitler referenced had been eliminated, he accused them of lying. When they showed him casualty reports and strength assessments proving the units were gone, Hitler insisted the reports were falsified by traitors. The Führer was literally commanding ghost armies that existed only in his deteriorating mind. Stauffenberg left that conference knowing assassination was the only option. Germany was being led by a man so detached from reality that he issued orders to non-existent divisions, promised counterattacks with destroyed panzer corps, and believed in miracle weapons that would never be built. Negotiating with Hitler was impossible because he inhabited a fantasy world. The only solution was to kill him and hope a rational government could negotiate surrender before Germany was completely annihilated. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt failed. Stauffenberg's bomb wounded Hitler, but didn't kill him. The Führer survived, became even more paranoid, and spent the final 10 months of his life directing imaginary armies against real enemies. By early 1945, Hitler was ordering counterattacks by divisions that had ceased to exist, expecting relief from armies that had surrendered months earlier, and insisting that victory was weeks away, even as Soviet forces fought in Berlin's streets. The generals who survived the war later struggled to explain why they had continued serving Hitler once they recognized his insanity. Some claimed they were bound by their officer's oath. Others argued they hoped to mitigate his worst decisions. Many admitted they were simply cowards, too afraid of execution to resist. But the recognition itself was nearly universal among mocked senior leadership by 1943. Hitler wasn't just incompetent or fanatical. He was genuinely clinically insane, suffering from some combination of Parkinson's disease, drug addiction, and psychological disorders that manifested as delusions, paranoia, and complete detachment from observable reality. The tragedy was that this realization came too late. By the time most generals accepted that their Führer was mad, Germany was already doomed. The Wehrmacht had been bled white in Russia. Allied bombing was destroying German cities and industry. The Luftwaffe was defeated. The U-boat force was annihilated. No amount of competent generalship could overcome strategic decisions made by a lunatic over the previous 3 years. General Holder, who stood frozen in disbelief during that July 1942 conference, was dismissed by Hitler in September 1942 for insufficient fanaticism. He survived the war, but spent the rest of his life haunted by a question he could never adequately answer. Why hadn't he acted when he first recognized Hitler's madness? Why had he continued serving a deranged dictator who was leading Germany to destruction? The answer was complex, involving institutional loyalty, fear, denial, and the terrifying power Hitler wielded over his subordinates. But fundamentally, the German generals failed because they spent too long convincing themselves that what they were witnessing wasn't insanity, just unconventional leadership. By the time denial became impossible, it was too late to prevent catastrophe. The exact moment varied for each officer, but the realization was universal. Germany's leader wasn't a strategic genius making difficult decisions. He was a madman, giving orders to ghost armies, believing his own delusions, and dragging an entire nation into apocalyptic destruction while insisting until the end that victory was inevitable.